Caitlin had always been a master at deception. For months, I had watched as she skillfully weaved her little lies into the fabric of our everyday lives, convincing me that everything was fine. I had always trusted her. Until that one night. It started like any other evening. She'd claimed she was staying late at the office working on some big project, a vague excuse but one I'd heard countless times before. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just another late night, another work task. But as the hours passed and she didn't come home, something shifted in me. A nagging feeling began to creep up my spine, growing louder with each passing minute. I knew Caitlin well enough to recognize the subtle shifts in her behavior. The way her voice had sounded on the phone earlier, the way she had rushed me off with little more than a vague promise to be home late. It wasn't like her to leave me hanging without a clear reason. Something was off. I grabbed my coat and headed out, but not to the usual places I'd expect. Instead, I headed to her office. On my way, I stopped by the hotel she had claimed to be staying at earlier in the day. Just a hunch. When I walked into the lobby, I felt my pulse quicken. There it was. Proof. Staring me in the face. A receipt with her name on it. I didn't need to see more. I knew what it meant. She had lied to me. Caitlin had been somewhere else entirely, and she had no idea that I was about to expose her. I stood there in the lobby for a long time, the receipt burning a hole in my pocket. The anger simmered beneath the surface, but I wasn't about to let my emotions take over. I was calm, calculated, and methodical. I'd spent years carefully building my life with Caitlin. No more. I wouldn't let her control this anymore. The decision was simple. I wasn't going to confront her in private, that would be too easy. No, I wanted her to face the consequences, and I knew exactly how to do it. I wasn't going to shout, cry, or demand answers from her. I would simply show up, holding the proof, and let her unravel in front of everyone. I headed to her office, knowing the moment of truth was about to arrive. The next day was one of the longest in my life. The proof was undeniable, yet Caitlin still hadn't come clean. She had texted me briefly that morning asking how my night was, offering her usual flurry of nothingness, the kind of words that sound perfectly fine on the surface but ring hollow the second you know the truth. I didn't respond, knowing that any reaction from me now would only play into her hands. She was good at getting out of things with a calm, collected excuse, but this time, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an easy exit. Instead, I spent the day planning. I was no stranger to strategy. I had taken my time in every part of my life, from my career to relationships, making sure I never acted impulsively. The discovery of the hotel receipt was just the catalyst I needed. But what really mattered was what came next. Caitlin thought she could get away with it, continued to manipulate the situation as she always had. But she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her hide anymore. I replayed the details in my mind, each small piece falling into place. The receipt, her name clearly written on it, the date matching the night she'd claimed to be working late. That was just the beginning. I could have confronted her in private. I could have sat down and demanded an explanation, but that would have been too simple. Too easy. It wasn't about the answer anymore, it was about her knowing she couldn't escape the truth, and more than that, it was about the moment she would realize that her lies no longer had any power over me. I needed to make sure she knew I wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. There was only one place that would force her to face the consequences of her actions, fully and publicly: her office. I'd visited her workplace before, on the rare occasions I had to drop something off or pick her up, but this time would be different. I had no intention of announcing my arrival or giving her a chance to make her excuses. I was going to walk in, calm and collected, just like I had everything else in my life, and present the proof. That evening, as I prepared to leave, I made sure the hotel receipt was in my pocket, neatly folded but in plain view. I wanted to ensure that nothing would be left to the imagination. I could already picture the moment when I would walk into her office, holding the evidence up, and her face would freeze in shock. There would be no words, no explanations she could muster, just the silent confrontation of her lies. I stepped into the cool evening air, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. My pulse was steady, my thoughts clear. As I approached the building, I thought back to all the times Caitlin had been so smooth, so confident in her ability to convince me that everything was fine. She had always been the one who could bend the truth, tell her version of events with such ease, and leave me questioning my own instincts. But now I had the upper hand. The truth was in my pocket, and I was going to make sure it was seen. The elevator ride to her office floor was a quiet one. I was alone, which was a strange relief. There was no one to distract me from the moment that was about to unfold. As the elevator doors slid open, I felt a sudden calm. My heart didn't race, my thoughts didn't spiral. I wasn't angry, I wasn't frantic, I was just determined. The kind of cool, collected certainty that had always defined me. When I reached her office, I paused. Her name was on the door in neat letters, but it felt distant, almost foreign to me now. I had seen that name every day for the last few years, but it had always been in the context of love, trust, and companionship. Today, it felt like a reminder of a relationship that had become a lie. I didn't knock, I just opened the door, stepped inside, and there she was, sitting at her desk talking on the phone with a client, her voice smooth, professional. She glanced up at me, her eyes flickering with a brief surprise that quickly shifted into her usual practiced calm. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I simply walked in and placed the hotel receipt on the desk, the crinkle of the paper loud in the silence of the room. Her eyes went straight to the receipt, and I watched her face drain of color. Her mouth parted as if she were about to say something, anything, but the words never came. She looked back at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of shock, confusion, and the faintest hint of fear. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The proof was in front of her and she knew it. The lie she had told so easily the night before was now staring her in the face, and I was the one who had placed it there. I could feel her trying to regain control, her usual smoothness slipping away as she fumbled for something to say. "Jack, she began, but I cut her off with a simple, quiet statement. "I thought you were working." The words hung in the air between us, final and unyielding. There was no room for debate, no room for negotiation. The truth had been delivered, and it couldn't be taken back. Her boss, David Harris, stood in the doorway then, having heard the conversation. He looked between us, uncertain, his face unreadable. Caitlin's eyes darted between the two of us, the reality of her situation settling in. She was caught, and now the world knew it. Caitlin froze. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. It was as if she had been caught in the middle of a performance and had forgotten her lines. The receipt sat between us, its presence undeniable, the symbol of the lie she had so easily crafted. I stood there, letting the silence linger, watching as she struggled to form an explanation. There was no way out this time. No well-rehearsed excuse that could mask the truth. Her boss, David Harris, shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his eyes darting between us. He was an older man, a little graying around the temples, but still someone who commanded respect in the office. He had always been polite to me whenever we met, but now I saw the hesitation in his gaze as he watched the tension unfold. It was clear he had no idea what was happening, no idea that the woman he trusted so much was about to crumble under the weight of her own deceit. Caitlin cleared her throat, attempting to regain some semblance of control. She pushed the receipt aside, but I could see her fingers trembling. Her eyes were wide, almost panicked, as she looked between me and her boss. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. The strength and confidence that she had always worn like armor were suddenly gone, replaced by a vulnerable uncertainty that was almost unsettling to witness. I can explain," she finally stammered, her voice shaking as she tried to push herself back into control. But I wasn't interested in hearing explanations anymore. This wasn't about me understanding her side of the story. It was about her facing the consequences of her actions. "Explain what, Caitlin?" I asked, my tone calm yet cutting. "That you were working late?" I motioned toward the receipt again, the simple piece of paper that had shattered her version of events. "Or that you were somewhere else entirely, with someone else?" She flinched, her face flushing with humiliation, but she didn't deny it. There was no need for her to. The truth had already taken root. Instead, she tried to play her usual game, the one where she would twist things, make me feel guilty for confronting her, but this time I wasn't having it. Her eyes darted toward David, almost as if looking for a way out. He shifted uneasily, obviously unsure how to handle the situation. His eyes flicked toward me, but he didn't speak, as if waiting for Caitlin to take control of the conversation, but she couldn't. Not anymore. She trailed off, unable to find the words. The look of shock on her face mirrored the realization that her carefully constructed world was crumbling. There was nothing left to hide behind. Her usual charm, her ability to smooth over any situation, was no match for the cold reality in front of her. David cleared his throat, stepping fully into the office now. He was a good man, decent, professional, but even he couldn't ignore what was unfolding before him. He knew Caitlin, had worked with her for years, but even he had to acknowledge the lie now. "I think it's best we step into my office, Caitlin," David said, his voice tinged with disappointment. It wasn't harsh, but it was firm. He didn't need to say anything more. He knew what had just happened. The trust was broken, and no amount of words could fix it now. Caitlin's eyes met mine one last time. I saw a flash of something there, a fleeting moment of regret, maybe, or fear, but it was gone just as quickly. She picked up her purse, her movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to buy herself a few more seconds before facing the inevitable. Without another word, she stood, walking past David, her head lowered. Her shoulders were slumped in defeat, and as she passed me, I could feel the weight of the moment settle between us. There was nothing left to say. She knew what she had done, and now it was time to face the fallout. As they disappeared into the back office, I remained standing in the doorway, my mind still processing what had just unfolded. For a moment I stood there, taking it all in, the quiet hum of the office, the faint sound of voices in the distance, but I felt nothing, no joy, no anger, just an empty sort of finality. I had exposed the truth, but I had no desire for revenge. It wasn't about that. It was about justice, letting the consequences fall where they may. I walked out of the building, the receipt still in my pocket, the weight of it a reminder of the past few days. Caitlin's life had just been shattered, but it wasn't my problem anymore. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. For me, the only thing left to do was move on. The next few days were a blur of quiet tension. Caitlin had been removed from the office, her professional world upended in the span of an hour. I hadn't heard from her since the confrontation. There were no apologies, no pleading, just a hollow silence. I knew she was likely trying to salvage whatever remained of her reputation and career. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I had delivered the truth, and now it was her turn to face the consequences. The weight of that realization settled on me like a heavy, unwelcome blanket. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about accountability. I had forced her to see herself, to confront the reality of her lies, and it was clear that the facade she had worked so hard to maintain had been stripped away. The pieces of our relationship, once glued together by trust and shared history, now lay scattered at my feet. There was no glue strong enough to put it back together. The silence between us stretched on. She didn't contact me, and I didn't reach out to her. The events of that day had shifted the power dynamics of our relationship completely. It was no longer about trying to fix things, to have conversations, or to seek closure on her terms. It was over, and in that finality there was a strange sense of relief. But even with that relief, I couldn't help but wonder how she was handling it. I couldn't ignore the image of her face as she left her office, her head low, her shoulders sagging. She hadn't cried, but I could see the sting of betrayal in her eyes. She had never imagined that she would be the one exposed, the one forced to face the truth. In that moment she had become the person she had always tried to avoid being, vulnerable and exposed. The following day I received a call from her, but it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't an apology or an explanation as I had anticipated. Instead, it was a simple, flat statement. "I'm moving out," she said. The words were devoid of emotion, almost clinical in their delivery. No anger, no pleading. Just a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. "I'm done," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond right away. What was there left to say? She had already made her choice. The damage had been done, and all that was left now was the process of letting go. I could hear the finality in her words, and for the first time I realized that she had already made peace with her actions. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was simply accepting the end. "I'll have my things packed by tonight," she continued, her voice steady but distant. "I'm sorry for what happened, Jack, I am. But it's over." And with that she hung up. I didn't feel relief or triumph, nor did I feel anger. I was numb, caught in the quiet aftermath of everything that had transpired. My mind was blank as I sat there staring at my phone. It wasn't that I had expected her to beg for forgiveness or try to salvage things. No, that was never going to happen. But somehow, hearing those final words, so cold, so resigned, left me empty. Later that evening, Caitlin came to collect her things. The apartment felt different somehow, emptier. As she walked through the door with a suitcase in hand, there was no confrontation, no fighting, no emotional outbursts. Just two people who had once shared a life now standing on opposite sides of the room, bound by nothing but the remnants of what used to be. She packed her things in silence, each item she gathered a reminder of the years we had spent together. There were no words exchanged as she filled the boxes. I didn't need to say anything, it was all over. She didn't look at me as she moved around the room, her movements mechanical. I could see that her mind was somewhere else, lost in the weight of her own thoughts. I didn't want to look at her either. The woman I had once known was gone. When the last of her things were packed, she turned to face me, her expression unreadable. For a moment there was an awkward pause, two people whose paths had crossed in so many ways, now standing at the end of them. "I guess this is goodbye," she said, finally breaking the silence. It wasn't bitter, but it wasn't warm either, just flat, devoid of any real emotion. I nodded, watching as she walked out the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the apartment. When the door clicked shut behind her, I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet settle in. There was no closure, no final words, just the soft sound of her departure. I wasn't sad, I wasn't relieved, I was just done. A few weeks passed after Caitlin left, and the weight of everything that had happened finally began to settle. The apartment felt like mine again, though it wasn't the same. It was strange, walking through the rooms that had once felt like home, where memories of our years together were so tightly woven into the fabric of the space. I tried not to linger on those memories, but they were hard to ignore, especially when I was alone with my thoughts. I didn't call Caitlin, and she didn't reach out to me either. The silence between us remained, thick and impenetrable. I knew she had moved on to her own life, and as painful as that was to admit, it didn't change the fact that I had to do the same. I had no desire to beg for an explanation or seek any sort of reconciliation. What we had was gone, and now it was time to look forward. I threw myself into work, focusing on my career with a renewed sense of purpose. I hadn't realized how much of my attention had been consumed by Caitlin and the lies she'd told. Now, without the weight of her deceit dragging me down, I felt a freedom I hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, I was living for myself. No strings attached, no distractions. It wasn't easy. There were days when the loneliness crept in, reminding me of the companionship I had once shared with Caitlin. But I knew deep down that the person I was now was stronger than the one I had been before. I had faced betrayal head-on and come out the other side intact. There was no going back to who I had been. I had to embrace who I was becoming. Then, one evening, I ran into someone at a local cafe. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't a romantic encounter, but there was something different about this meeting. A sense of lightness, a glimmer of possibility. I wasn't looking for someone new, but it felt good to connect with someone who didn't come with the baggage of the past. We exchanged numbers, shared a laugh, and parted ways, but something in me stirred that hadn't in months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to move forward.